Good afternoon. Will the Standing Committee on Public Accounts please come to order? This meeting has been called to consider the following reports. Auditor General's report, public accounts, and other financial statement audit dated August 2018. Public accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2018, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Auditor General's report, understanding our audit opinion on Manitoba's March 31st, 2018 summary financial statements dated September 2018. Public accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2019, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Auditor General's report, understanding our audit opinion on Manitoba's March 31st, 2019 summary financial statements dated September 2019. Auditor General's report, public accounts, and other financial statements dated December 2019. Auditor General's report, follow-up of recommendations dated March 2020. Public accounts and other financial statements. For the committee's information, pursuant to Rule 104, brackets 2, I would like to note the following substitution for this afternoon's meeting. Ms. Adams for Ms. Naylor. Before we get started, are there any suggestions from the committee as to how long we should sit this afternoon? Mr. Lindsay.
Suggest 6 o'clock and then revisit at that time.
Do we have an agreement? Do we have an agreement to sit until 6 o'clock or until and review? Agreed and so ordered. Are there any suggestions as to which order we should consider the reports?
Global.
It's been suggested global. Do we have an agreement? Agreed and so ordered. Does the Deputy Auditor General, Tyson Stakalo, wish to make an opening statement? Sorry, Mr. Stakalo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would first like to introduce the staff members who are with me today. Seated behind me is Natalie Bissett-Asumadu, who is the director responsible for all financial statement audits in our office. Next to Natalie is Shane Sharon, who is the principal in charge of our audit of the province's summary financial statements. Mr. Chair, it is important that public sector financial statements comply with both the letter and the spirit of the applicable accounting standards. Financial statements prepared in accordance with public sector accounting standards provide the Legislative Assembly with meaningful, comparable, and consistent financial information. At the conclusion of every financial statement audit, an auditor issues an opinion on whether the financial statements are fairly presented. An unqualified or a clean opinion is issued when the auditor is satisfied that the financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position and results of the entity being audited. However, in 2019, for the second year in a row, our office issued a qualified opinion on the province's summary financial statements. A qualified opinion signals to users that they need to be cautious when relying on the financial statements. When we say in a qualified opinion that certain aspects don't comply with standards, know that as an independent office of the Assembly, our audit opinions are supported by a rigorous evidence-based process and represent an objective and unbiased audit which adheres strictly to Canadian auditing standards developed by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. A qualified opinion is not issued lightly and should be taken seriously by users of the summary financial statements. In our September 2019 special report to the Assembly, which is one of the reports before you today, we explain the issues that are the basis for our qualified audit opinion on the summary financial statements. The qualification was based on two issues. The first related to the exclusion of WCB as part of the government reporting entity, and the second was with respect to the exclusion of assets held in mass insurance trusts. In December 2019, we issued our annual report on financial statement audits conducted by our office, which covers both the public accounts audit and all other financial statement audits we either perform directly or perform using an agent. Reporting on our findings from these financial statement audits and providing recommendations is one way our office adds value to the Legislative Assembly. This report identifies certain aspects of the government's financial reporting which add complexity to understanding the summary financial statements. Our report clarifies 3 areas that are key to maximizing the understanding of the financial statements. First, the fiscal stabilization account or rainy day fund, and understanding what is and what it is not. Transfers in and out of this fund have no impact on the province's summary financial statements, neither on the annual results nor on the net debt and accumulated deficit. Second, the province's use of trusts and other structures to segregate funds, and providing some insight into how these different structures are accounted for in the province's public accounts. And third, discussion of the change in accounting policies at RHAs in 2019 as directed by the province. While the changes resulted in changes to the RHA's financial statements, there is no impact on the summary reporting in the public accounts. Our office will continue to work in a proactive and collaborative manner with the Department of Finance in assessing the appropriateness of proposed accounting treatments to ensure continued or enhanced transparency and accountability within the areas in question, and that accounting standards are well understood and applied. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you. Does the Deputy Minister, Richard Groen, wish to make an opening statement, and would he please introduce his staff joining him here today? Mr. Groen.
Yes, sitting with me today is Andrea Tsai. She's the Executive Director of Public Accounts in the Office of the Provincial Controller, and Anne Ulisoy, who's the Provincial Controller. And yes, I'd like to make an opening statement. I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to provide some brief comments. As my predecessor has already made an opening statement on the 2017-18 reports on the agenda, I'll confine my opening statement to the public accounts for the year ended March 31st, 2019, understanding the Auditor General's audit opinion on the March 31st, 2019 summary financial statements, and public accounts and other financial statement audits dated December 2019. I shall endeavor to answer all administrative-related questions posed by the committee on the reports reflected on today's agenda. As always, it is possible we may need to take some questions as noticed and provide a specific response to the question in writing at a later time, and we will endeavor to do so promptly. The provincial public accounts for the year ended March 31st, 2019, volumes 1, 2, and 3 were released on September 26, 2019, in accordance with required legislation. Volume 1 includes the economic report, the financial statement discussion and analysis, and the audited summary financial statements of the government. The province experienced a summary loss of $163 million, which was $358 million under the budgeted projection of $521 million. This is the third consecutive year that the province has come under budget. Summary net debt is $25 billion, a $654 million increase from the previous year. The increase in the net debt is the result of a summary loss of $163 million, a net increase in tangible capital asset investments of $246 million, unrealized losses of investments of $225 million in the government business enterprises due to mark-to-market accounting, and net increases of $20 million in non-financial assets and miscellaneous adjustments. In addition to the financial statements, the financial discussion and analysis report includes trend information on the financial condition of the government. During 1819, the FSDA outlines a number of key indicators. For example, one such key indicator is the net debt of the government as a percentage of the provincial economy or gross domestic product or GDP. In fiscal 2018-19, this percentage was 34.6%, essentially unchanged from the 34.5% in fiscal 2017-18. I would also highlight for you two additions to Volume 1. On page 6, an infometric on taxes and fees paid by a typical Manitoba household and where that money is spent and invested. Also, there are 11 pages 63 to 73, on strategic outcomes that were achieved during the 18-19 fiscal year. Volume 2 includes the audited schedule of public sector compensation payments of $75,000 or more and the unaudited schedule of government departments and special operating agencies payments in excess of $50,000. 2018-19 is the first year that the public sector compensation payments is prepared using the new legislative threshold of $75,000 or more. The prior years used a threshold of $50,000, and that had not been changed since 1996 when the Public Sector Compensation Disclosure Act was first passed. The amendments to the Act improved the public accessibility to the reports, reduced red tape for the not-for-profits that receive provincial funding, and mandated the disclosure of all employment contracts and severance payments for political staff. Volume 3 includes unaudited supplementary schedules related to the core government and other information required for statutory reporting requirements. The Office of the Auditor General released a special report to the legislature entitled Understanding Our Audit Opinion on Manitoba's March 31st, 2019 Summary Financial Statements dated December 2019. The report provides the legislature and the public with a deeper understanding of the two qualifications of the province's summary financial statements in fiscal 2019 from the perspective of the OAG. It is important to note that Manitoba does not take the qualified opinion lightly. It has been over a decade since Manitoba received a qualification from the Office of the Auditor General on the summary financial statements. In the case of the 2019 qualifications, the Department of Finance, frankly, has a professional disagreement with the Office of the Auditor General on the application of public sector accounting standards. In the case of the Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation transferred to the trust accounts, it is the position of Manitoba that the trust assets are not controlled by the corporation and therefore neither by the province. As for the Workers' Compensation Board qualification, legislative changes to the Workers' Compensation Act were tabled as Bill 21 on November 28th. It is the province's opinion that once the proposed legislative changes are enacted, the Workers' Compensation Board will no longer be viewed as controlled. We have worked with the Office of the Auditor General to get to this point. Likewise, similar work is taking place with respect to the Hail and Agri-Insurance Trusts in the Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation. I would like to thank the staff at the Comptroller's Division who prepare the public accounts. I also want to thank the now retired Mr. Norm Ricard and his staff, particularly those present today. I also want to acknowledge their professional and their collaborative relationship with the Department of Finance, and we look forward to building on this relationship going forward. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions from committee members.
Thank you. And before we proceed further, I'd like to inform those who are new to this committee of the process that is undertaken with regards to outstanding questions. At the end of every meeting, the research officer reviews the answer for any outstanding questions that the witness commits to provide an answer and will draft a questions pending response document to send to the Deputy Minister. Upon receipt of the answers to those questions, the research officer then forwards the responses to every PAC member and to every other member recorded as attending that meeting. Therefore, I'm pleased to table the responses provided by the Deputy Minister of Conservation and Climate to the questions pending responses from the June 25th, 2020 meeting. These responses were previously forwarded to all the members of this committee by the research officer. Before we get into questions, I would like to remind members that the questions of administrative nature are placed to the Deputy Minister and the policy questions will not be entertained and are better left for another forum. However, if there is a question that borders on policy and the minister would like to answer that question, or the deputy wants to defer it to the minister to respond to, that is something we would consider. The floor is now open to questions. Mr. Lindsay.
Well, thank you very much, and it certainly should be interesting doing these two series of reports that really both had the qualified opinion, which hasn't happened, and I recognize the Deputy Minister talked about it hasn't happened for quite a number of years to have one, never mind to have two of them back to back. So I'd just like to ask the Deputy Auditor General about the seriousness of having qualified opinions attached to these audits, and particularly having qualified opinions year after year dealing with the same issues. And is that a serious issue?
Mr. Sticalo.
I definitely would consider it a serious issue. Preparing financial statements under a formal set of accounting standards, such as the public sector accounting standards, is important for ensuring consistency and comparability, not only from year to year, but also from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I will say that we have been working collaboratively with the Department of Finance on looking at the two qualifications from the previous 2 years. And I am satisfied that there is a commitment to address the issues that underlie our qualifications.
Mr. Lindsay.
So I understand what you're saying. So now after you issued, or your predecessor, I guess, issued the first audit report with the qualified opinion, there would have been steps, I'm assuming, taken after that, and yet here we are the second year with the same qualified opinion. So maybe you could just explain what transpired between those two audit reports that left the Auditor General still putting the qualification in place.
Mr. Sticalo.
Okay, so with respect to the Workers' Compensation Board, in the first qualification in 2008 was on the fact that the Department of Finance took a look at the criteria of control under public sector accounting standards and came to the conclusion that it was not controlled. We did an analysis, which we've laid out in our report, and came to the conclusion that the preponderance of evidence was that the workers' compensation, as it had been in previous years, controlled in accordance with the criteria under public sector accounting standards. There was nothing that had happened from previous years to trigger a change in our assessment, but nonetheless we undertook an assessment right from the start and arrived in that position. Similarly, in 2019, with respect to Workers' Compensation Board, there was no changes in the factors that we considered to be controlled. A lot of those factors that we considered were requirements that are in the Workers' Compensation Board's legislation. So barring any change in that, we qualified for the second year. With respect to the qualification on mask insurance trusts, in 2018, these So this is for the fiscal year ended March 31st, 2018. In September 2018, the legal trusts were formed. An accounting entry was made to accrue a payable and recognize an expense for a transfer to these trusts as at March 31st, 2018. When we looked at that transaction itself, regardless of the assessment of the trusts, it didn't meet the criteria of a government transfer at March 31st, 2018. So we qualified on that basis. Keeping in mind that these trusts were established right near the end of our audit work and the issuance of the public accounts, we continued to look at the structure of the trusts that were established, the insurance trusts that were established at MASC, and by March 2019, we had completed our assessment that despite the fact that the assets, that the money was in a legally formed trust, the province controlled the use of those funds, therefore it met the definition of an asset. So we qualified in March 2019 on the basis that controlled assets were not included in the summary financial statements.
Mr. Wishart.
Following up with the Deputy Auditor General on the mass trusts in particular, there is federal legislation that determines the surpluses and the origin and where it can be paid out. And it's very clear that benefits in accumulated surpluses from the crop insurance programs, or the mass trust in this case, can only be paid out to producers. And in fact, the money is, 40% of it is actually of producer origin, 40% is federal origin, and only 20% is provincial. And because of the matching federal legislation, there's provincial legislation, there's federal legislation that determines this. How is it you would determine that to be a provincially controlled asset when there is federal legislation that tells you you cannot use it for any purpose chosen?
Mr. Sticalo.
While I agree that the money that is eventually in the trusts or were held previously in the reserves of MASC originate from the federal government, producers, and the province, MASC, the corporation, under its legislation, is directed or legislated to administer the insurance programs, both for the production, crop production insurance, and for the hail insurance. That legislation, through that legislation, it is MASC, the corporation, that takes the assets, holds them, administers them, and pays the amounts out in accordance with the insurance agreements, which, at least on the production insurance side, do have federal requirements written into them. Because the corporation is using the amounts sitting in the trusts to extinguish or to meet their obligations under public sector accounting standards, that indeed does meet the definition of an asset. If the trusts just cease to exist, the liability would still rest with the MASC, the corporation. So the fact that this amount of money is either being paid from a reserve held internally or in a trust where MASC, the corporation, directs all the payments from, the control rests with the corporation.
Mr. Wishart.
Following up with that line of logic, other jurisdictions, of course, have accumulated surpluses, some in trust, some held in reserve. What do other provinces do in regards to accounting standards when it comes to this, as crop insurance of one type or another exists in every province? Is this standard practice across the country?
Mr. Sticalo.
I won't speak to what other jurisdictions do, or rather, I won't speak to why other jurisdictions are accounting for things the way they do, but based on our survey, we identified the province of Quebec as one jurisdiction that did use trusts. We also noted that there was extensive reference to the trusts in the legislation, but we didn't go through, so some of the structure is a bit different, but we didn't go through and do an analysis of how the province of Quebec rationalizes their treatment.
Mr. Wishart.
So did you look at other provinces? As you know, Quebec frequently has slightly different legislation because of their quite different system in terms of legislation. I am well aware that many other provinces, in fact, use trusts in regards to this. Have you looked at other jurisdictions other than Quebec?
Mr. Sticalo. Mr. Sticalo.
Well, we did do a cross Canada jurisdictional scan. We didn't note any other jurisdiction that was accounting for it in the same manner that the province started to, with respect to accounting for them as trusts under administration, according to public sector accounting standards.
Mr. Wishart.
Thank you. Other provinces have legislation to create the surplus pools, whether they're trusts or not, whether they're just surplus pools. And as Manitoba actually had the first version of the legislation in the country, much of the legislation in other provinces is very similar to Manitoba's legislation. We were the first ones. They copied that, and it spread across the country relatively rapidly. Why would there be a difference of interpretation as to whether it's a provincially controlled asset when the legislation is actually very similar?
The Auditor General. Deputy Auditor General. I think he's...
I don't know if I can answer why it would be different. I do know that we did a thorough analysis of comparing what the structure was in the province to the public sector accounting standards. We did consultations with other experts in the accounting field, and we were confident, based on our analysis of the province's structure to public sector accounting standards, that they met the definition of an asset. I can't speak to why there'd be differences or with similar situations in other jurisdictions.
Sure.
Just one final question related to this. The government of the day in 2002, there was a substantial surplus in crop insurance at the time, and it was not a trust. Sought an opinion from the federal government as to whether they could disperse some of this for purposes other than crop insurance, and we're told they could not. So how is it that the province would have jurisdiction, would not have jurisdiction over it then, and would now?
Deputy Auditor General.
I'm assuming nothing's changed over as far as using it for another purpose. I agree that currently that the monies that are held in the trust, similar to the money that were held in the reserves within the corporation in the past, could only be used for one purpose, and any accumulated surplus could only be retained for future payment of indemnities. So I don't think anything's changed since 2002 with that respect.
Mr. Lindsay.
Before I get back to my original line of questioning, I just a quick follow-up on what Mr. Wishart said. So right now, with the funds in trust, there was at some point in a previous trust or a different jurisdiction where they wanted to pay something out other than just for the intended purpose, and the government said, no, that couldn't happen. So does that not indicate that the government still has control ultimately over the fund?
The Deputy Auditor General.
I'm not sure if I'm clear on your question. You're asking if the example given of 2002, when, and I don't know, I'm not familiar with this, but my interpretation was that in 2002, the province or MASC sought to distribute some of the accumulated surplus. The federal government, because the amounts that are collected and paid out are subject to an agreement with the federal government would not allow that. And so that's the situation. And you're asking, maybe you could you clarify what your question was as far as does that not indicate something?
Mr. Lindsay.
Perhaps maybe misunderstood. I thought that line of question was that the provincial government had said no, those funds couldn't be used. So the way it stands right now, the money is put into this trust, so the provincial government can't say that they couldn't use that money to do something other than what it was intended for. Is that what you're saying?
Deputy Auditor General.
Yes.
Mr. Lindsay.
So just to get back where I wanted to go in the first place, just talking a little bit more about the workers' compensation for now. So former Auditor General stated, in my opinion, WCB is controlled by the province based on the definition of control in the PSAS and should be recorded in the summary financial statement for the years ended March 31st, 2019 and March 31st, 2018 in respect to the summary financial statements are not in accordance with the PSAS, which requires the financial operations of controlled entities to be consolidated. So has anything changed in that regard?
Deputy Auditor General.
As of March 31st, 2019, no.
Mr. Lindsay.
Okay, thank you for that. So then in 2018, the government concluded that the WCB is not controlled and removed it from government reporting. And please forgive me if I'm asking the same questions in different ways over again. I just want to try and make sure I understand. So could you explain the definition or test of control as it pertains to the PSAS standards and how the government is in control of the WCB?
The Deputy Auditor General.
So I think the best way to answer this question is to refer to our report, Understanding our Audit Opinion on Manitoba's March 31st, 2018 Summary Financial Statements, page 6. Halfway through, we talk about the following factors which indicate that the government controls the WCB, and they're bullet pointed there. I can read through them. All WC board members are appointed by government. While government must consult with relevant stakeholder groups for the purpose of making board appointments, the ultimate authority and discretion in appointment lies with government. The WCB may make regulations in many areas impacting its operations, as described in Section 68(1) of the Act. However, the government can disallow any regulation within 30 days. We noted the government controls the scope of Workers' Compensation Board and its revenue-generating capacity through the regulation it enacts to control which types of employers must pay premiums into the accident fund. And finally, the WCB must provide a grant to government from its accident fund to cover expenses incurred by government in administration. So, of those 4 points, those are ranked in probably order of what we would consider significance or relevance to determining control. So most certainly, we would consider the fact that all WC board members are able to be appointed by government, despite the fact that, under current legislation, despite the fact there must be consultations held.
Mr. Lindsay.
Oh, my understanding of the term consultation means that the people being consulted may make suggestions, but it doesn't mean that the government has to follow those suggestions. The government could, in fact, still appoint whoever they wanted, or tell the entities, no, pick somebody different than what you've suggested. Is that correct?
Deputy Auditor General.
Yes, that's consistent with our interpretation of the legislation as it's currently worded.
Mr. Lindsay.
So the 4 things that you've indicated in your report and that you put on the record here today, the first one, the board members are in fact still appointed by the government, or the government still controls who's appointed. So when it comes to the regulations made by WCB, has anything changed in that regard? The government still controls what those regulations are. The government still has the ultimate authority in deciding to allow something that WCB has put forward to pass or to not. Is that my understanding correct?
The Deputy Auditor General.
Yes, as I had mentioned, as at March 31st, 2019, there had been no changes to the legislation which would address that ability. However, we do note that there has been a bill that's been put forward to specifically address some of these items, but it has not passed, and I'd probably refer you to the Department of Finance for further information on what they see as in how that bill would address some of our concerns underlying our qualification.
Mr. Lindsay.
And we can talk some about what that bill may or may not do in a bit if we want, but right now there's nothing has changed as far as the WCB Act or anything that would say that your qualification is still not in place. So going forward, if for whatever reason the legislature didn't sit again for a period of time, or the bill didn't pass, or it didn't get discussed, there would be nothing right now as it stands to change your qualification.
The Deputy Auditor General.
No, there'd be nothing to change our qualification.
Mr. Lindsay.
So right now, the way it stands, the WCB provides an annual grant to the province. So nothing has changed in that regard either. So really everything that you've talked about in your two qualifications going 2018, 2019 are still exactly the same. And if nothing changes, those qualifications would still be in place. So I guess how would we, recognizing that everybody has said that those qualifications are a pretty serious matter, if those don't change, then potentially we'd be looking at another budget year with the qualifications exactly the same still in place. Is that?
The Deputy Auditor General.
Yes, we would.
Mr. Teitzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just if I could ask the Deputy Auditor General to maybe comment a little bit more on the legislation that was put forward with regards to the Workers' Compensation Board. Now, sadly, I don't think that legislation was allowed to pass through the House or receive royal assent. But if said legislation, I presume, were before the House again and given the opportunity to receive royal assent, would that in any way affect his opinion of the qualification issued regarding the Workers' Compensation Board in the budget?
The Deputy Auditor General.
Well, until the legislation's passed and until I have the financial statement audit opinion in front of me to sign, I wouldn't say definitively, but I will refer back to my opening comments where I refer to working collaboratively with the Department of Finance, and we certainly have had discussions regarding the changes that are put forward, and our initial assessment was that legislation does address the factors that we've identified on page 6 of our report.
Just getting back to the mask.
Oh, Mr. Teitzman.
Sir, thank you very much for that, Deputy Auditor General and Mr. Chair. Just getting back to mask, and I was happy to have my colleague, Mr. Wishart, who's got far more experience in that area, address that question. But I guess there still remained a question unanswered, which is how many provinces use, or how many provinces' financial statements include mask-like assets and their balance. In other words, we understand that your interpretation of PSAS is one way, and our finance department is another way. I guess what I'm asking for is when there's a difference of opinion between professionals, normally you'd expand the circle to other Auditor General departments and other departments of finance across the country. So how many other provinces include mask-like assets in their financial statements the way you're asking Manitoba to do?
The Deputy Auditor General.
To my knowledge, all provinces except for Quebec.
Mr. Lindsay.
So just to get back to the WCB, we understand that there may be a bill that at some point in time may pass, but it appears that right now the way that bill is worded, that board members, excluding employee representatives, are still appointed by cabinet. So nothing changes in that regard with the bill as it's been introduced. So then would that lead there still to be that qualifications even if this bill was to pass?
Deputy Auditor General.
You know, I really don't want to speculate. I would wait and see what the bill reads that is passed, or what the amendments to the act are once the bill passes, before we would conclude definitively on that.
Mr. Teitzman.
Mr. Chair, just following up to the previous response given to me by the Deputy Auditor General, if you could undertake to confirm that understanding and provide a response back to the committee, I would appreciate it. Regard to the province's take on whether or not mask-like assets are in their balance sheet.
The Deputy Auditor General.
So we can undertake to provide something, but I just, maybe if I could ask you to just clarify what the exact question is that you want an answer on.
Mr. Teitzman.
Yeah, essentially, it's on the difference of opinion that we're having between our Manitoba government and the Office of the Auditor General. I'm seeking to understand a way to cut through that without any expertise. So I'm not a financial expert, but you are, and I presume the deputy minister is, and many others. And so I think, given the similarity between the original mask legislation and other provinces, I would like to see that confirmed, I guess, that across all provinces, all these assets are indeed considered. And then you did mention the exception of Quebec. And so with regards to Quebec, where they do use a trust, if it could get a better articulation of why our use of trust was not the same as their use of trust, I would appreciate that as well. But just trying to understand where the differences of opinion may be springing from.
The Deputy Auditor General.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so we will undertake to come up with a list of provinces who have assets on their financial statements similar to the assets that the province we will undertake to provide a cross-jurisdictional scan for mask-like entities in other provinces and the treatment of those assets.
Mr. Lindsay.
So just to keep you bouncing around back to WCB again for a minute or two, we've seen, I guess, the draft regulations, and maybe my question would be better directed to the Deputy Minister. So could the Deputy Minister explain if grants or transfers are still going to take place from WCB to the government, especially when it comes to funding certain government programs?
The Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the fee has to do with a grant to the government for work that's performed by the provincial government in respect of the administration of the Workplace Safety and Health Act. And those payments would continue as long as those services are being provided. So it's a cost recovery, it's not a transfer.
Mr. Lindsay.
So, from what we've seen so far, is there's not a whole lot changes with the impending legislation that would cause the Deputy Auditor General to change his qualified opinion. The government still will maintain control of the board. There still will be monies paid back to the government to do the same things that those things or monies are doing right now. So in the, I guess, speculative opinion of the Auditor General, and I realize that's not really your area of expertise is to speculate on things, but looking at the legislation the way it's worded at present, there's not really enough in there to change your qualification. Is that a fair statement, or would you need more information than what we've had so far, that the control is still control of the board by the government, fees are still being paid to the government from WCB, government still has control of regulations, so in essence the government, even with this bill, if it does come to pass, there really is no substantive change that would change your qualification. Is that correct?
The Deputy Minister.
I would say this with respect to the legislation that was tabled last December. If you read the explanatory notes that accompany the bill, it addresses in particular the first two bullets that the Deputy Auditor General identified of the four, and he said that these were in descending importance. So the first one had to do with the fact that all board members are appointed by the government. Under the legislation, employee groups and employer groups will provide nominations from which the government will appoint members to the board, and that will make up a majority of the board, but it will be from nominations provided by employees and employer groups. And that should remove the appointment by the government by enough of a degree to show that the government doesn't have control of the board. Secondly, any regulations made by the Workers' Compensation Board that can currently be revoked or by the provincial government, that authority is being eliminated under the new legislation. So in particular, those first two bullets are being addressed in the draft legislation, and it would always be inappropriate to make any decision until legislation receives royal assent, because it is subject to committee hearings and review by this body, and amendments could be made either at the committee stage or within the chamber by legislative members, and until it receives royal assent, we really don't know what the act is going to say. And so I would support what the Deputy Auditor General is saying, is once the legislation receives royal assent, a final determination could finally be made on whether or not it addresses the bullets that have been identified in here as being indicators of control.
Mr. Lamont.
Yeah, this is a question for the Deputy Minister of Finance. I understand there is a difference of opinion. However, if the WCP is not under the government's control, why is it necessary? Why is the government bringing in legislation?
The Deputy Minister.
So we did an analysis, an interjurisdictional analysis, as part of our ongoing due diligence to determine our government reporting entities, especially those that we identified that could introduce volatility onto our summary financial statements. And as part of that exercise, we identified the Workers' Compensation Board as one where there was potential. So we reviewed the legislation with respect to Manitoba and all the other provinces. We determined and concluded that the legislation was very similar across jurisdictions. However, only Manitoba and Saskatchewan included the Workers' Compensation Board as a government reporting entity, and all the other jurisdictions who had their financial statements approved by the offices of the Auditor General in those jurisdictions, having excluded the board. So we thought we were on very solid ground, and so on that basis, we excluded them from the 17-18 public accounts. I would note, if we read past the bullets that the Deputy Auditor General identified in his statements with respect to the September 2018 report on understanding their audit opinion, if you go to the very next page, it says, as defined by public sector accounting standards, control of an entity by government is a question of fact, but it's not always clear and may require the application of professional judgment. And that goes back to my opening comments, where we frankly have a professional disagreement. We agree with the Office of the Auditor General in 8 other provinces, and we went on that basis as well, because they're also governed by the public sector accounting standards that we're subject to. So we thought we were on very solid ground in our conclusions.
Mr. Lamont.
I'd like to table, this is an article from the CFIB website from May 3rd, 2019. Manitoba's WCB rebates $74 million but remains significantly overfunded. And one of the things it has is it has a timeline of all the times the CFIB submitted to the Manitoba legislature, the meetings they had with ministers, and there were a whole series of meetings with Minister Peterson at the time, Deputy Premier Heather Stevenson, Premier Pallister. There were a whole series of meetings throughout 2017 and 2018 before CFIB ever met with WCB's president. And can you see how this might create the impression with the public or with MLAs that perhaps government does have a role in controlling that WCB, if there's that much, if this is clearly something that was linked as a lobbying effort on part of CFIB?
Deputy Minister.
I would say this, in my 30 years experience, the government meets with a lot of agencies, boards, and commissions, not just ones that are part of the government reporting entity. So whether the entity is part of our summary budget or not, the government meets with them, and that's not unusual. So that'd be my first point. Secondly, the Workers' Compensation Board is subject to provincial legislation, and they do serve a public service. So it would not be unusual for them to meet with the province to discuss their role and how best they see they need to serve that role and advise government in that regard, and the government to meet with them to make sure that they're meeting the expectations as well. And there's a number of boards that those kind of meetings take place with, including, for example, it could be the Law Society, it could be the Chartered Professional Accountants of Manitoba, meet with the provincial government to discuss their role, and none of those organizations are considered part of the government reporting entity, but those meetings nonetheless take place.
Mr. Lindsay.
Just to get back to the line of questioning that I was going down. So, in the opinion of the Deputy Auditor General, would it be better to just include WCB back into the summary financial statements, or is the province handing over control of the WCB the better option?
The Auditor General.
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to comment on what would be better. I mean, if there's no change, we would continue to assert that the WCB is part of the controlled government reporting entity and should be consolidated. But whether circumstances change or it's brought back in, either of those will get rid of the qualification, which is ultimately what I'd like to see.
Mr. Lindsay.
The amendments that have been talked about so far, I mean, we've heard from the Deputy Minister saying, well, we're not going to appoint people to the board, but in essence, they are. The entities will be allowed to nominate candidates, but it's still up to the government who gets to be on the board and who doesn't. So, in your opinion, would the amendments, if they don't do everything to correct what's caused you to put the qualification on the audit, is that going to be enough to cause you to not have a qualification, or do you think that based on the discussions we've heard here so far on the proposals that more would need to be done? And have you had ongoing discussions with the department about where you would like to see those kind of things go in order for you to not have the qualification?
Deputy Auditor General.
I think has been mentioned a couple times this evening. We are working with the Department of Finance to provide them feedback on proposals, which would include proposed amendments to the Act. But until those amendments are passed and put into the Act, I won't provide an opinion or opine on whether what is in a bill right now would be enough to remove the qualification.
Mr. Lamont.
Yeah, this is for the Deputy Minister of Finance. There was recently a fiscal update as well about some of the recent COVID measures, and this does relate to the Workers' Compensation Board, because on page 28, the appendices, summary of the investments, and I'd like to table this. It has WCB financial relief $37 million. Can you explain why this would be included in the recent fiscal update, if this is not supposed to be something that's on the government's books?
Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a list of events and activities that have taken place in Manitoba to basically help Manitobans and businesses in Manitoba deal with the COVID-19 pandemic that we've all been dealing with, particularly since the state of emergency was called on March 20th. And the financial relief provided by the Workers' Compensation Board was relief that was determined by the Workers' Compensation Board and approved by the Workers' Compensation Board, and was included in the list in recognition of the steps that they took to join the Manitoba government in providing relief.
Mr. Lindsay.
I have a question for the Deputy Minister, looking at some of the changes that we've talked about here. Can you explain what the impact will be from the government turning over control to the WCB and no longer being the controlling party, if you will, that they are right now?
The Deputy Minister.
So, I mean, from a financial reporting perspective, The Office of the Auditor General has highlighted and identified the impact of the Workers' Compensation Board being included as a government reporting entity in our summary financial statements. So that's on the financial side. On the other side of the equation, if you're looking at the control we exercise legally over their governing statute, I mean, their mandate is not being impacted, it's their governance that is being impacted. And so, again, it's a different level of control, and it's not necessarily we're removing the levers that, working with the Office of the Auditor General, they've identified that would assist in identifying a change that has been made from prior years that would allow them to prospectively basically remove the qualification with respect to the Workers' Compensation Board. But there are other amendments being made that have to do with the legislation, and so that has to do with their statutory obligations and mandate, which isn't being amended. It's just their governance that's being amended for purposes of removing the qualification.
Mr. Lindsay.
So it seems to me, and maybe I'm jumping to conclusions, but in the process of trying to get away from reporting the WCB the way it presently reported for financial reasons, that the government is turning over control of the WCB, and the concern is, in that process, does it alter the ultimate operation of WCB and how it operates going forward, just to meet a financial reporting goal as opposed to an actual goal for WCB and the government?
Deputy Minister.
So I would say that that's certainly not the intention in terms of their governance structure to go above and beyond what we've worked with the folks at the Office of the Auditor General. But I guess once passed and in force, the test of time will, if it reveals otherwise, then we'll know at that point. But that's certainly not the intention at this point in time with the proposed amendments.
Mr. Wassalou.
I have a question for the Deputy Auditor General. Just following up on something he stated, that there was ongoing meetings between his office and the government over the proposed amendments. I'm wondering if you can expand on that and tell us how many meetings there's been, who's been at these meetings, what has been discussed at them, are there future meetings scheduled?
Deputy Auditor General.
So the audit of the public accounts, which our office does, of the summary financial statement, is approximately between 10 and 12,000 hours of work each year. A lot, during that time, we have regular meetings with the Office of the Controller and her staff on various accounting issues. At times during the summer, it's almost on a weekly basis. There are also perhaps ad hoc meetings that take place. So you would almost say, except for maybe a few months in December and January, we're in constant contact with the Office of the Auditor General, talking about our audit plans, what we're going to be looking at, what areas we're going to be looking at, issues that they see with changing accounting standards, etc. As a regular course in those meetings, We will engage in discussions on the qualifications and things that they're doing in an effort to address the qualifications. So part of those conversations were indeed, going through what we had identified in the RTL and looking at what was being proposed in a bill and having a discussion. At no point would I ever say, or anyone in my office say, no, you need to do this to change this. We don't provide that direction. They come to us with a question. We'll provide our thoughts on it, but at the end of the day, the decisions that are made by the Department of Finance are theirs, and we try. We specifically will not provide a direction to go on anything, whether it be language in a bill or an accounting treatment in the financial statements. Just to further illustrate that, there may be a new program or even a new accounting standard. So part of the process is we'll meet with the the Department of Finance, Office of the Controller. They'll provide a position paper saying, we propose taking this and do this, this, and this because public sector accounting standards say this, this, and this. We'll provide a position paper back saying, you've considered this, this, and this. Have you fully considered this? So there's a lot of back and forth. Part of those conversations inevitably is on the issues that underlay our qualifications. But I can't provide anything more specific about our conversations than that.
Mr. Wasilou.
One of the issues with the previous qualified opinion was that the board members were appointed by government and that was too much control. So I'll just give you a hypothetical. So say you have a system where an employers submit a short list, the workers submit a short list, but the government ultimately picks who they want off that list. So they still retain the decision that who's on the board. Is that control or is that not control?
The Auditor General.
The assessment of whether an entity is controlled is as we point out in our report, a matter of fact, but it's subject to professional judgment. And what the standards do is they set out primary factors and secondary factors. So each of those are considered on their own merits, and based on the preponderance of evidence provided by that, we determine whether we believe an entity is controlled. So the situation that you propose, we would have to look at in combination with all of the other factors.
Mr. Wasilou.
What are the primary and secondary factors?
Deputy Auditor General.
Okay, so I am quoting from Public Sector Accounting Standards, section 1319. First persuasive factor is a government has the power to unilaterally appoint or remove a majority of members of the governing body or organization. Number 2, a government has ongoing access to the assets of an organization, has the ability to direct the ongoing use of those assets, and has ongoing responsibility for losses. The third persuasive factor would be the government holds the majority of the voting shares or a golden share that confers power to govern the financial and operating policies of the organization. And D, the government has unilateral power to dissolve the organization and thereby access its assets and become responsible for its obligations. Then there's some secondary, less persuasive factors to provide significant input to the appointment of members of the governing body of the organization by appointing a majority of those members from a list provided or being otherwise involved in the appointment or removal of a significant number of members. Then it goes, there's some other ones, appoint or remove the CEO or other key personnel, establish the mission or mandate of the statement of the organization, approve the business plans or budgets of the organization, establish borrowing or investment limits, restrict the revenue generating capacity of an organization, so those would be, in public sector accounting standards, the persuasive and less persuasive indicators of control.
Mr. Wasilou.
I want to turn to MASC. Now, my understanding is that MASC benefits from trusts because the trusts are paying MASC's obligations. Do I have that correct?
Deputy Auditor General.
Yes.
Lou.
And MASC decides who gets paid and who does not. Is that correct?
The Deputy Auditor General.
Yes.
Mr. Wasilou.
And I also understand that MASC has the obligation to pay even if there isn't enough money in the trust. Is that also correct?
Deputy Auditor General.
Yes.
Mr. Wasilou.
The Minister, does he agree with the 3 points just made by the Deputy Auditor General, explicitly how MASC trusts are assets of the province?
The Deputy Minister.
The Department of Finance would not agree that MASC as a corporation benefits from the trust agreements. They basically administer contracts of insurance for hail and agri-insurance. In agri-insurance case, it's subject to a federal cost-sharing agreement, so there's considerable restrictions putting on the contracts, and so we would not characterize the corporation as benefiting. The reserves, in the government's opinion, belong to agri-producers. They do not belong as an asset for the benefit of the Manitoba government, and by putting them into trust, it ensures that that money will forever be for the benefit of agri-producers and not for the benefit of the government, notwithstanding the disagreement over the financial reporting and public sector accounting standards and whether they should be included or excluded as assets of the Manitoba government.
Mr. Wasilou.
So I think I want to clarify with the Deputy Minister. So is the department currently using a different definition for public assets that doesn't align with the public, accounting standards?
Deputy Minister.
So in the Department of Finance's opinion, and these opinions are developed by members who are CPAs, just like there are in the Office of the Auditor General, who are familiar with the public sector accounting standards. In our opinion, we are abiding by the public sector accounting standards, and we're relying not only on the public sector accounting standards with respect to control of assets, but also with respect to trusts under administration. And trusts under administration are not consolidated into the financial reports of the provincial government, or any government for that matter, and we're relying on those provisions as well. And that's why, in part, we chose the path that we did, which was to transfer those reserves into trusts for the benefit of agri-producers with respect to insurance, crop insurance, and hail insurance.
Mr. Wasilou.
So, unlike WCB and MASC, the auditor supported the designation of funds transferred to other trusts as an appropriate transfer for the purposes of public accounting. And to give some examples, they include the Conservation Trust, the Grow Trust, Heritage Resource Fund, and the Military Memorials Conservation Fund. However, and this question for the Auditor, Deputy Auditor General, does the Auditor have any concerns with large transfers of funds to external agencies?
Deputy Auditor General.
I wouldn't comment on the policy decision to make large transfers to trusts. You know, for the purposes of financial accounting, that's where my concern would lay. The reason for including that in our RTL is so that that readers of our report can see that there are different ways to account for similar transactions, and that those are important questions to ask to fully appreciate, you know, the way things are accounted for.
Mr. Wasilou.
Well, I mean, we've seen significant swings in government's stated financial position in the year transfers made. And does the Deputy Auditor General have any concerns regarding to the transparency with these other trusts?
The Deputy Auditor General.
We don't, or I don't have any concerns with regards to the transparency. The information's available. It's just sometimes confusing for users of financial statements to get a complete picture, and that is why we included that information in our report.
Mr. Wasilou.
Okay. Well, you had indicated, to use your words, confusion as a result of the use of these transfers. How about murkiness over issues of control? And for example, the Auditor General believes that the government can maintain decisions who gets the annual funding and leave the trust job to simply administer investments. So I guess my question is to the Deputy, could the Deputy explain the rationale or benefit the government sees in creating these many external trusts?
The Deputy Minister.
So I would say this, that the intention of the trust is to secure future financing for purposes of undertaking government policy initiatives, whether it be in climate or the environment or rehabilitation, and that's kind of the stated purpose of establishing these trusts. In terms of choosing it as a form, a policy decision to choosing that form to provide that certainty of funding going forward, I think I would defer to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Wasselu.
My question is to the...
I'm sorry. Finance.
Yeah, I guess the comments I can make follow up from what Finance Minister said. I think it is, there is good financial reasons of why we do this. I mean, they work to a certain extent. The Conservation Trust works almost like an endowment fund, where every year there's monies that are generated from this, and so we think it makes a lot of sense to do that. And it's money, for instance, we paid out, I think, close to $5 million in different grants for conservation types of initiatives. It's money that is generated and works quite well. Trusts aren't something that's new to governments. Previous governments have used them. Governments really across the nation should be there. So I think it is an important financial tool to use that to generate some additional dollars, to create some operating dollars to support programming that's in place.
Wasselu.
For the Auditor General, would you see it as beneficial to consider this matter as a public policy review?
Deputy Auditor General.
I'm sorry. The question was, would I see this?
Mr. Wasselu.
Would you see this as a beneficial area to consider as a matter of a public policy review?
Deputy Auditor General.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I wouldn't comment on, whether I see something as beneficial or not from a public policy point of view. You know, my concern is that it's been accounted for appropriately in the books.
Mr. Wasselu.
Now, in your 2019 public accounts, as been stated, the management of the trust funds by the Winnipeg Foundation is in compliance with PSAS accounting standards. Could you explain if the funds managed by the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce, for example, the Mineral Resource Development Fund, would also align with the PSAS account practices?
A Deputy Auditor General.
If I could just get you to reference in the report, it would be helpful. Chamber of Commerce. Winnipeg Foundation. Okay, so the question was?
Mr. Wasselu.
I'll repeat the question. Now, in your 2019 public accounts, you stated that the management of the trust funds by the Winnipeg Foundation is in compliance with PSAS standards. And I'm wondering, are you in a position to explain if the funds managed by the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce the Mineral Resource Development Fund would also be in alignment with those standards.
The Deputy Auditor General.
So we don't comment in here, I think specifically on the Chamber of Commerce, but we do point out that, on page 27, that there's different options for financial reporting, not options, but different ways, depending on how it's structured, they can be accounted for. In the case of the Winnipeg Foundation trusts, the money going out to them was accounted in accordance with PSAS as a grant, so expensed in the year that the money flowed or was paid over. And then in future years, as money becomes available to the province, that's recognized as revenue and then expensed when paid out from the province. The accounting treatment for the Chamber of Commerce grants, I believe, was slightly different, but because we don't refer to it in our report, if you have questions on the accounting for those amounts that were paid, I would refer that question to the Department of Finance.
I want to return to MASC and my questions to the Deputy Minister. It's been 2 years since this issue was raised, and I'm wondering what remedial action has or is the government taking to ensure that the Auditor General doesn't need to issue a qualified opinion in 2021.
The Deputy Minister.
I'll defer to the Minister of Finance.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
So the government has been meeting, I think as the Deputy Auditor General had indicated, almost at this time of year, almost daily in terms of these types of issues. Our hope is to address these accounting professional differences between it, so we continue to meet with the Auditor General. I think we have a good working relationship with them, so our hope as a government is to address not just the worker compensation issue, but the issue as it relates to the trusts.
Mr. Wasilou.
So I guess I'll ask this of the Deputy again. So what changes are planned to the trust, or are there going to be any changes to the trust?
The Deputy Minister.
So I think it would be premature for me to comment on exactly what changes are going to be made. There's reference in the 2020 budget document that this work is taking place and a resolution is being worked on. The exact form of that resolution is still being finalized at this time. And I think once that resolution has been reached, I think we will be announcing what steps we're taking and why, and it'll be there for all the world to see in terms of how we resolved this impasse in getting rid of the qualification from the OAG.
Mr. Wasilou.
So without any changes planned in the foreseeable future, will you be including this in the summary accounts to avoid a qualified opinion this year? And that's to the Deputy.
The Honourable Minister.
As indicated before in our previous answer, we want to work with the Auditor General and his office to resolve not just one qualification, but both the qualifications. I think we worked pretty effectively on the first piece of legislation, the Worker Compensation Board, which was, well, I'll just say it was delayed, and the legislature, because of political wranglings back and forth. In any event, we were unable to pass the legislation. So we found a legislative fix to that, and I think what we'd like to do is continue to work with the Auditor General's office to find some sort of a solution that will kind of amend both the professional differences that can allow us to get out of a qualification position as a government.
Mr. Wasilou.
So on page 10 of the report, it states that excluding entities from government reporting entity that are still controlled by the government does not provide a complete picture of the financial position and results of the government. I guess I'll ask the Deputy Auditor General if he agrees with that statement.
Deputy Auditor General.
I can't find the exact reference in the report, but I mean, just as a statement, yes, I would agree with that. If you control something and you don't include it, you're not showing a complete picture.
Mr. Wasilou.
I'd ask the same question of the Deputy Minister, whether he would agree with that statement.
Honorable Deputy Minister.
I mean, I would answer it on the basis that we continue to report on the basis we have the last 2 years, and we will continue to do so going forward. I'm not in a position to talk about the 2019-20 public accounts that will be released next month, and I think we'll all find out what decisions have been made when those are released at that time.
Mr. Wasilou.
I guess, I don't know if the Deputy heard me, but the question was whether or not you agreed with the statement that excluding entities from the government reporting entity that are still controlled by the government does not provide a complete picture of the financial position and results of the government. Would the Deputy Minister agree with that statement or disagree with that statement?
The Honorable Minister.
I'd renew just the answer that I gave last time. Sometimes there's professional disagreements amongst people that are in the same profession, and as such, I'll give you an example with the Worker Compensation Board. Even though the way we accounted for it, Manitoba and Saskatchewan are the only ways. There's other jurisdictions that accounted for this. That's the Worker Compensation Board in a different way. They didn't get qualifications. With that being said, there is a respect from the government side to the Auditor General in terms of their opinions, and so we want to work with the Auditor General to come to a conclusion to make sure that there isn't qualifications on these things. So what I would say is, again, there's a professional difference sometimes, but we'll continue to work with the Auditor General's office to resolve those that may or may not include legislative changes or other changes that we can make, but we want to ensure that the Auditor General is well aware and that we get out of qualifications. That is the goal of the government.
Mr. Wasilou.
Part of the auditor's objectives is stated on page 14, and I quote, are to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the summary financial statements as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, end quote. So I guess this is for the Deputy Auditor General. So following your qualified opinion from 2017-2018, the government then proceeded to exclude WSB and MASK for a second year in a row. Would you attribute this to fraud or to error?
Come on. It's ridiculous. Deputy Auditor General.
I don't know what I'd attribute it to, but it was certainly, from my perspective and my office's perspective, an error.
Mr. Wasilou.
Well, since your office had identified this issue the year prior, would you agree then that the last year the province knowingly misrepresented their financial statements?
The Deputy Auditor General.
We issued our opinion in 2018. The Department of Finance prepared their financial statements for 2019, well aware of our issues. And the statements are the Department of Finance's to prepare and make decisions on what they include or do not include. And I likewise in 2019, or our office likewise in 2019, expressed our opinion on those statements.
Mr. Wasilou.
So, given that they knew what the issues were and refused to correct them, how do you interpret it?
Deputy Auditor General.
I determined the exclusion of the workers' compensation and the MASK Insurance Trust to be an error in the summary financial statements.
Mr. Wasilou.
So now on page 13 explains, quote, had the WCB and MASK Trust departures from PSAS been corrected, the province would have had an annual surplus of $9 million in the current year, 2019, and for the prior year, 2018, would have had an annual deficit of $347 million, end quote. So I'll ask again, do you believe that the government knowingly misrepresented their financial statements?
Deputy Auditor General.
I won't speak to what they know or don't know. They presented their financial statements. In our opinion, the deficit was overstated in both years because they didn't include WCB and the Mask Insurance Trust.
Mr. Wasilou.
Now, on page 10 of the 29, understanding my audit opinion, it states, quote, eliminating their impact on the summary deficit or surplus must be given careful consideration to ensure transparency and accountability and that accounting standards are not compromised, close quote. So if the government had complied with your recommendations from 2019-20 fiscal year, or they begin to in this current 2021 fiscal, could you explain how this would benefit or harm the province's deficit?
Deputy Auditor General.
So in that paragraph that you refer to, if I can maybe paraphrase what we're saying, is that while we understand that volatility arising from or changes or impacts on the deficit arising from funds that have, or trusts or funds that have a specific purpose, should continue to be accounted for in accordance with accounting standards, despite the desire to segregate them. So the impact, I mean, again, goes back to what you were describing. For 2019 and 18, as laid out, an understatement of the deficit in both years. For impacts going forward, if things weren't to change, I can't speak to that.
Mr. Wasilou.
So the basic effect is by not including these assets, it's making the province look like it has a larger deficit than it actually does. And in one year, if actually the province was in surplus and the government maintained that it wasn't. Is that fair?
The Deputy Auditor General.
I'm not going to, say anything further on that other than in our audit opinion, we laid out what the impact was.
Mr. Wasilou.
I have a question for the deputy. Do you plan to remove any other government reporting entities from summary financial statements in the future?
Honorable Minister.
We make determinations, a budget process that makes sense for Manitobans. There's a budget process happens through an estimates. I can't give you any indications of that. The budget process starts, and we'll review everything that makes sense for taxpayers of Manitoba.
Mr. Salute.
My question's for the deputy. Do you plan to remove other government reporting entities from the summary financial statements in the future?
The Deputy Minister.
We continue to review the financial reporting results for government reporting entities. We continue to do our due diligence by determining whether or not they fall within the public sector accounting standards. We continue to do reviews that could include interprovincial or legislative reviews that could result in decisions such as, for example, First Nation Child and Family Service Authorities being removed from the public accounts as well as being outside of our control. So we continue with that work, and that work will go unabated, and once we make a determination that it is part of the government reporting entity or it should be part of the government reporting entity, we'll report either through our budget or our public accounts on those changes.
Mr. Wasilou.
Again, for the deputy, will the province move to include money held by the Workers' Compensation Board and the Agricultural Trust back in its summary financial statement in 2021?
Honourable Minister.
These are political types of questions, and they're policy questions that will be made by Cabinet as well as other members of the government. We have fantastic people supporting us in the public service, but those decisions are made politically. That's a part of it. We want to address these, as mentioned, both the qualifications. We are working with Auditor General's office to address these issues, even though there's some difference of professional discretion with these types of things. We want to get these things addressed, and we want to make sure it's as open and transparent and the qualifications go away, and so we'll continue to work with Auditor General. I can't comment beyond that of any other decisions on it. We believe the decisions we made make sense for Manitobans. Our concern before was previous governments were taking credit for money that wasn't theirs, whether that be through the Mass Trust or Worker Compensation Board. Our concern is we want to make sure that we're more of a transparent government than the previous government.
Any further questions? Mr. Teitzman.
Deputy, I've noticed on that the net debt has been climbing and climbing quite a lot over the years. I'm wondering if that is going to continue indefinitely, or if we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the growth of the net debt over the last 10 or so years, as indicated in the report. Will it continue to climb, or is there light at the end of the tunnel?
What's the question? Deputy Minister.
So a lot of our borrowing requirements that have been adding to gross debt from hydro we're now on the other end of that curve. We've kind of peaked already with Bipole 3 and Kias, so that'll reduce our borrowing requirements. As far as the government activity, as the annual summary net income gets closer to zero, then our net debt growth will also decline. I'll also indicate that we have to continue to borrow for capital investments that are made on an annual basis, and basically until you have a surplus that exceeds your capital investment, you'll have to continue to debt finance your capital, but that's also on a declining path, growth path compared to prior years. And as we make investments into the provincial economy, the metric that is used, which is net debt to GDP, not just net debt as an absolute number, but relative to what the economy can support, we expect that to decline as well.
Wasilou.
I'm wondering if the Deputy Minister can tell us that, given their view of the WC and MASC, if either one of these entities runs out of money, does that mean that the province of Manitoba will not be on the hook and will not have to fund those agencies, and those agencies will be on their own, and if they run out of money, then it's a problem that they will have to deal with internally?
This is Deputy Minister. Sure.
That's a very hypothetical question that we haven't come across yet, so I'm not sure I'm in a position to give you an answer at this point in time, to the extent that it hasn't arisen. That's why there are reserves. That's why those reserves are being put in trust to reduce the volatility, not for the Manitoba government, but for the benefit of agri-producers, so that their premiums don't have to increase exorbitantly in a bad year in which there's flooding or drought that impacts their ability to generate receipts, and vice versa. So that's the purpose of the reserves. The reserves are there to be managed by the entities for the purposes of the benefit of agri-producers and employers and employees when it comes to the Manitoba Workers' Compensation Board. And those policies are reviewed by a group of professionals who manage the investments to make sure that the actuarial and the portfolio is appropriately sized. And all those organizations provide annual reports that may comment on those reserves to make sure they're adequate in circumstances. The volatility that they would experience in an extreme situation that would require provincial support hasn't come up, to my knowledge.
Mr. Wasserman.
The government's position is that MASC and WCB are independent organizations that are not controlled by the province of Manitoba. If they are not controlled by the province of Manitoba, then they would not be the province problem if they ran into financial issues. So being consistent with your position, would you state on the record now that should either one of these entities get into financial difficulties, they would not be bailed out by the province of Manitoba, given your position?
Deputy Minister.
So I would make a correction. We have indicated that we do not control the Workers' Compensation Board, which is why we've removed them from our summary financial reporting. We have never indicated that we do not control Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporations. What we have said is that the trusts are not assets that are controlled by the provincial government, and the money in the trust, therefore, are not assets of the Manitoba government. We have never said that Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation is not controlled by the Manitoba government.
Hearing no further questions or comments, I will now put the question on the reports. Number 1. Shall Volume 1 of the Public Accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2018 pass? The report is accordingly passed. Shall Volume 2 of the Public Accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2018 pass? The report is accordingly passed. Shall Volume 3 of the Public Accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2018 pass? This report is accordingly passed. Shall the Auditor General's report, Public Accounts and other financial statement audit dated August 2018 pass? This report is accordingly passed. Shall the Auditor General's report, understanding our audit opinion on Manitoba's March 31, 2018 summary financial statements dated September 2018 pass? The report is accordingly passed. Shall Volume 1 of the Public Accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2019 pass? The report is accordingly passed. Shall Volume 2 of the Public Accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2019 pass? The report is accordingly passed. Shall Volume 3 of the Public Accounts for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2019 pass? The report is accordingly passed. Shall the Auditor General's report, Public Accounts and other financial statement audit dated 2019 pass? The report is accordingly passed. Shall the Auditor General's report, understanding our audit opinion on Manitoba's March 31, 2019 summary financial statements dated September 2019 pass? This report is accordingly passed. Does the committee agree that we have completed consideration of public accounts and other financial statements of the Auditor General's report, follow-up of recommendations dated March 2020? Agreed and so ordered. Before we rise, it would be appreciative if members would leave behind any unused copies of reports that they may have collected and reused at the next meeting. The hour being 5:57, what is the will of the committee? Any rise?